Picture this: a battlefield where the real weapons weren't swords or arrows, but fear, deception, and the sheer power of the human mind. Long before modern psychology, medieval generals were already masters of mental manipulation, wielding tactics so effective they could shatter enemy morale without a single physical strike. These commanders understood something profound. Victory wasn't just about brute force, it was about controlling the narrative, playing on emotions, and exploiting the deepest fears of their opponents. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on their hidden playbook. Think about the last time you felt truly unsettled, maybe by a rumor, an unexpected sound in the dark, or the eerie silence before a storm. Now amplify that 1,000-fold, and you'll start to grasp the psychological battlefield these generals orchestrated. They didn't just fight armies, they fought perceptions. Siege towers weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of inevitability, designed to make defenders question their own walls. Rumors spread like wildfire, turning allies into suspects and confidence into paranoia. Even the weather could become a weapon, with commanders timing their attacks to exploit the dread of a moonless night or the disorientation of a sudden fog. What makes these tactics so fascinating isn't just their brutality, it's their brilliance. These strategies were crafted with an almost artistic understanding of human nature, leveraging everything from superstition to sheer spectacle. And here's the thing, these methods didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. The same principles of psychological warfare echo through modern conflicts, advertising, even politics. So as we dive into the minds of history's most cunning commanders, you're not just learning about the past, you're uncovering the timeless playbook of influence and control. Ready to see how fear and deception shaped the course of history? Let's begin. One of the most devastating weapons in a medieval general's arsenal wasn't made of steel, it was the chilling grip of fear. Commanders didn't just want to defeat their enemies, they wanted to paralyze them with dread long before the battle began. Take siege warfare, for example. The slow, ominous approach of towering trebuchets wasn't just a practical threat, it was theater. Imagine standing on castle walls as those massive arms creaked into position, knowing they could hurl not just stones but fire, rotting carcasses, even barrels of quicklime that would choke the air with toxic smoke. The message was clear: resistance meant unimaginable suffering, but the real genius lay in how these generals weaponized uncertainty. The Mongols mastered this art. Before attacking a city, they might launch severed heads over the walls, a grisly preview of what awaited those who defied them. Sometimes they'd even spare a few survivors from a nearby massacre, sending them fleeing to spread tales of horror. This wasn't just brutality, it was psychological calculus. A terrified population often pressured their leaders to surrender, saving the attackers months of costly siege work. What's striking is how these tactics exploited universal human instincts, the fear of disease, of fire, of the unknown. These were vulnerabilities no armor could shield. And medieval generals didn't need modern psychology textbooks to understand that. They knew that when soldiers watched their comrades succumb to panic, discipline crumbled faster than any gate. That's why the smartest commanders didn't just rely on force. They staged demonstrations of power, like parading prisoners or displaying mangled siege engines as trophies, all to seed doubt in the enemy's ranks. Yet fear alone wasn't enough, it had to be precise. A misstep could backfire, turning terror into desperate resolve. The best strategists balanced intimidation with just enough hope to make surrender seem preferable. They might offer generous terms to the first villages that yielded, then broadcast those stories widely. Suddenly, resistance felt less like bravery and more like foolishness. This delicate dance of dread and deception reveals something timeless about conflict. The mind is always the first battlefield. Deception wasn't just a trick, it was an art form, perfected by medieval generals who understood that perception could be deadlier than any blade. Imagine an army marching toward what they believed was a vulnerable enemy camp, only to realize too late that the flickering lights in the distance weren't tents at all, just rows of torches planted in the ground. Or picture a cavalry charge lured into a narrow valley by a seemingly disorganized retreat, only to find the hillside suddenly lined with archers. These weren't just battlefield tactics, they were elaborate illusions designed to rewrite reality in the enemy's mind. Take the Byzantine general Belisarius, who faced overwhelming odds against the Goths in the 6th century. Instead of conceding defeat, he turned his weakness into theater. By having his troops march in looping formations, kicking up dust and repositioning banners, he created the illusion of reinforcements constantly arriving. To the Goths, it looked like an endless stream of soldiers, a psychological masterstroke that made them question their own numbers, and it worked. Hesitation crept in, their advance slowed, and Belisarius bought the time he needed to regroup. But deception went far beyond visual tricks. Sound played a crucial role too. Some commanders ordered their men to beat drums or blow horns from multiple directions, creating the impression of encircling forces. Others spread false rumors through merchants or prisoners, leaking fabricated plans that sent the enemy scrambling to defend the wrong locations. The key was understanding human psychology. People tend to believe what they expect to see, and medieval generals exploited that bias ruthlessly. Perhaps the most daring deceptions were the staged retreats, a high-risk gamble that could unravel an entire army if poorly executed. The Mongol warlord Subutai was a master of this. He'd feign panic, allowing his cavalry to appear scattered and vulnerable, drawing overconfident enemies into a deadly trap. Once pursuers broke formation, hidden reserves would close in from the flanks, cutting off escape. It was a lethal game of reverse psychology. The more convincing the retreat, the more devastating the counterstrike. What's remarkable is how these tactics blurred the line between warfare and performance. Generals weren't just strategists, they were directors staging an elaborate production where the enemy audience had no choice but to believe the fiction. And that's the chilling brilliance of medieval psychological warfare. It didn't just defeat armies, it made them complicit in their own downfall. Siege warfare was a slow, grinding chess match where patience and psychology often proved deadlier than any battering ram. While cutting off food supplies weakened bodies, medieval commanders knew that breaking spirits was far more effective, and they crafted siege tactics with surgical precision to exploit every human weakness. Take the calculated cruelty of allowing messengers to flee a besieged city. On the surface, it seemed like a lapse in security, but in reality, it was a masterstroke. Those fleeing messengers became unwitting agents of terror, carrying tales of starvation and impending doom to neighboring towns. The despair didn't just spread outward, it echoed back into the besieged walls, amplifying the fear of those left behind. But the real art lay in manipulating hope. A shrewd general might offer lavish surrender terms to one district of a city, while publicly executing resistors from another. This wasn't random brutality, it was a deliberate strategy to fracture unity. When some defenders saw their neighbors treated mercifully, loyalty crumbled under the weight of self-preservation. The Siege of Jerusalem in 1099 showcased this chillingly. Crusaders didn't just rely on brute force, they orchestrated a psychological symphony. After breaching the outer walls, they allowed certain gates to remain open just long enough for defenders to witness the fate of those who resisted burning buildings, fleeing civilians, the inevitability of collapse. The message was clear: surrender now or become part of the carnage. Even the architecture of siege engines played into this mental warfare. The deafening creak of a trebuchet's counterweight wasn't just mechanical noise, it was a countdown to destruction, each groan ratcheting up tension. Commanders might launch hollowed-out logs filled with screaming prisoners over city walls, turning the sky itself into a weapon of sound. Others staged mock assaults at random intervals, keeping defenders in a state of exhausted vigilance. Sleep deprivation became as lethal as any arrow, with soldiers too drained to fight effectively when the real attack finally came. What's fascinating is how these tactics mirrored the very hierarchies of medieval society. Just as kings used spectacle tournaments, executions, grand processions to control populations, generals adapted those same principles to warfare. A siege wasn't just about conquering land, it was about demonstrating the futility of defiance. And when the walls finally fell, the psychological groundwork ensured that surrender wasn't just an act, it was a relief. The true victory wasn't in taking the city, but in making its people believe they'd already lost. In the heat of battle, symbols could strike deeper than swords. Medieval commanders didn't just wear armor, they crafted identities, turning their very appearance into instruments of terror. Take Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. His darkened armor wasn't merely a practical choice, it was a calculated statement. Imagine facing a figure clad head to toe in shadowed steel, his visor hiding all expression, more specter than man. That deliberate ambiguity played on primal fears, making him less a mortal foe and more an omen of death itself. Religious symbols amplified this psychological edge to staggering effect. Before charging into combat, armies might parade sacred relics, a saint's bone, a fragment of the true cross, transforming the battlefield into holy ground. For their own troops, this promised divine favor, but to the enemy, it whispered of celestial judgment. During the Crusades, the sight of a bishop raising a crucifix could send ripples of doubt through Muslim ranks, just as the crescent standard of Saladin stirred unease among Christian soldiers. Faith, wielded strategically, became a double-edged sword, one side emboldened, the other unnerved. Then there were the Vikings, whose raven banners weren't just flags but prophecies woven in thread. Legend claimed these banners would flutter with eerie life before victory, their dark birds seeming to take flight. To opponents, that ripple of fabric wasn't just wind, it was fate manifesting. The Danes under Harold Hardroder flew such a banner at Stamford Bridge, and its ominous presence alone reportedly froze Saxon hearts mid-charge. Even colors played their part. The blood-red surcoats of Teutonic knights screamed aggression, while the pristine white mantles of Templars broadcast invincibility. Heraldry turned knights into walking propaganda, their crests broadcasting lineage, valor, or past conquests. A lion rampant or dragon coiled on a shield wasn't decoration. It was a silent challenge, a reminder that this warrior carried the weight of legend into battle. What made these symbols so potent was their universality. A peasant levy might not understand Latin battle cries, but they couldn't mistake the golden eagle of Rome or the snarling wolf pelts of steppe nomads. Symbols transcended language, bypassing reason to tap directly into emotion. And that's why medieval generals polished their iconography as diligently as their blades, because sometimes the right emblem could win wars before the first arrow flew. The roar of a medieval battlefield wasn't just chaos, it was a carefully composed symphony of terror. Generals didn't just rely on the clash of steel, they weaponized sound itself, turning noise into a psychological battering ram. Take the Ottoman Empire's legendary Kos drums, massive instruments taller than a man. Their deep, resonant booms could carry for miles. Before a charge, these drums would strike in unison, creating a rhythmic thunder that didn't just signal an attack, it simulated the heartbeat of an approaching storm. Enemy troops would feel the vibrations in their chests before they even saw the cavalry, their bodies tensing with primal dread. But it wasn't just about volume. The Swiss pikemen perfected a more subtle form of sonic warfare. As they advanced in tight formations, their boots struck the ground in perfect sync, punctuated by guttural chants in their native German. This wasn't random shouting, it was a deliberate cadence, oral proof of their discipline and cohesion. To opponents, that rhythmic precision sent a chilling message. These men moved as one organism, unshakable and unstoppable. The effect was so potent that some armies reportedly broke ranks before the first pike even leveled. Even silence could be a weapon. Scottish Highlanders were known to suddenly cease their battle cries mid-charge, leaving only the eerie rustle of tartan and the click of shifting weapons. That abrupt quiet was often more unnerving than any scream. A psychological void where anticipation curdled into panic. Likewise, Mongol horse archers would sometimes attack in near-total silence, their hoofbeats muffled by felt wrappings, appearing like ghosts from the steppes until it was too late. The brilliance of these tactics lay in their universality. You didn't need to understand the language of war drums or battle cries to feel their impact. Sound bypassed reason, speaking directly to the lizard brain, the part that flinches at thunder or freezes at a predator's growl. Medieval commanders grasped this instinctively, turning every clash into a multisensory assault where ears betrayed eyes and fear drowned out courage. When the horns blared, the drums pounded, and thousands of voices roared as one, it wasn't just noise. It was the sound of an army's will being crushed before the first blow landed. Betrayal cut deeper than any blade in medieval warfare because it didn't just wound bodies. It shattered the very bonds holding armies together. Commanders knew that a single act of treachery could unravel months of preparation, turning allies into liabilities and strongholds into death traps. Consider the fall of Constantinople in 1204, where whispers of betrayal slithered through the city like poison. Venetian crusaders, supposedly allies of the Byzantine emperor, exploited internal rivalries to stoke paranoia among defenders. By the time the gates were mysteriously left unguarded, suspicion had already done the invaders' work, sowing chaos that made the actual attack almost secondary. But betrayal didn't always require grand conspiracies. Sometimes a well-placed rumor was enough. A general might spread word that a nobleman's loyalty was wavering, or that a garrison commander had secretly negotiated surrender terms. The genius of these lies, they didn't need proof to take root. Fear did the heavy lifting. Defenders would eye each other with suspicion, withholding supplies or reinforcements, just in case, weakening the entire war effort from within. The Mongols excelled at this, often sending fake deserters into enemy camps with tales of impending betrayals. These manufactured crises forced enemies to waste precious time rooting out imaginary traitors instead of preparing defenses. Even religion could be twisted into a tool of deceit. During the Reconquista, Christian and Muslim rulers alike would exploit shared faith to lure opponents into false security. A promise of safe passage under holy oath might be violated, or a truce banner used to mask an approaching assault. These breaches weren't just tactical, they were psychological earthquakes, eroding the very idea of honor in warfare. After all, if even God's symbols couldn't be trusted, what could? What made betrayal so devastating was its ripple effect. One act of treachery didn't just change a battle, it rewrote the rules of engagement for generations. Survivors carried the scars of distrust into future conflicts, making alliances shakier and negotiations tenser. In a world where loyalty was the glue of empires, psychological warfare didn't just break armies. It broke the possibility of trust itself, and that was a victory no fortress could ever reclaim. Selective brutality was never about mindless violence. It was psychological warfare distilled to its coldest calculus. Medieval commanders understood that mercy and cruelty were two sides of the same coin, each carefully deployed to manipulate enemy behavior. Take Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187. After a grueling siege, he could have slaughtered every Christian defender. Instead, he allowed safe passage for surrendering forces and even ransomed many for modest fees. This wasn't weakness, it was strategic magnanimity. By showing restraint, Saladin painted himself as a ruler of honor, making future cities more likely to negotiate rather than fight to the last breath. Contrast that with Richard the Lionheart's actions at Acre just 4 years later. When negotiations stalled, he ordered 2,600 Muslim prisoners executed in full view of Saladin's army. The message was visceral. Defiance meant annihilation. The Mongols elevated this duality to an art form. When Genghis Khan's forces approached the Khwarezmian Empire, they didn't unleash uniform destruction. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared, their leaders incorporated into the Mongol administration. But one defiant town like Urgench would be erased so thoroughly that contemporaries wrote of cats being the only survivors. This created a terrifying rumor mill. Refugees carried tales of both mercy and horror, leaving the next city's rulers paralyzed by choice. Would they gamble on resistance and risk total extinction, or submit and survive? The brilliance lay in making surrender seem like the rational option rather than cowardice. Even the timing of brutality held psychological weight. Commanders might execute prisoners slowly during a siege, forcing defenders to watch from the walls as their comrades suffered. Others staged symbolic acts like impaling bodies along approach roads to ensure every arriving enemy soldier absorbed the warning before battle began. These weren't just acts of rage, they were carefully scripted performances. Like a playwright crafting scenes for maximum emotional impact, generals designed atrocities to spread far beyond the immediate witnesses. A single burned village could terrify a dozen others into compliance without further bloodshed. Yet the most effective commanders knew cruelty had diminishing returns. Pure terror could unite enemies in desperate resistance, as the Mongols discovered during their failed invasion of Japan. Typhoons aside, the samurai fought with suicidal intensity partly because surrender meant certain torture. That's why the masters of psychological warfare, like Saladin or Subutai, balanced ferocity with just enough fairness to keep surrender palatable. They turned brutality into a language where every act, every spared life, every burned city was a deliberate word in a sentence that ultimately read, "Resistance is futile." Faith was more than belief in the medieval world. It was a force commanders could harness like siege engines or cavalry charges. Consider Joan of Arc, the peasant girl whose visions of saints transformed her into France's living banner. To her countrymen, she embodied divine favor, her very presence making soldiers fight with the certainty of heaven's backing. But the English didn't attack her with arrows, they targeted her credibility, branding her a witch and heretic. This wasn't just slander, it was psychological counter-programming, an attempt to fracture the unshakable morale she inspired. The battlefield became a duel of narratives. Was she God's messenger or the devil's puppet? The answer could determine which side fought with holy fervor and which fought with doubt gnawing at their resolve. Astrology played a similar role in bending perceptions. Before major engagements, both sides would consult star charts, but shrewd commanders didn't just read the heavens, they staged them. A sudden eclipse, a comet's appearance, even the flight patterns of birds could be framed as omens. During the Battle of Agincourt, English longbowmen allegedly wore the emblem of Saint Christopher, while French knights scoffed at their peasant opponents until the mud-choked field turned their arrogance into a slaughter. Afterward, Henry V didn't just celebrate victory, he framed it as divine judgment, a lesson in how celestial symbolism could reframe disaster as destiny. The church itself became a theater of war. Bishops would parade relics along battle lines, blessing troops with bones of martyrs or splinters of the true cross. To the faithful, this wasn't ritual, it was a tangible transfer of holy power. Crusaders marching toward Jerusalem sang hymns under banners they believed carried actual fragments of Christ's shroud, while Muslim defenders countered with calls to jihad, framing resistance as sacred duty. These weren't just parallel devotions, they were psychological mirrors, each side using the same language of eternity to justify earthly violence. Perhaps the most chilling manipulation was the staged miracle. At the Siege of Antioch, a desperate crusader discovered the Holy Lance buried in a church, conveniently reigniting his army's waning spirit. Later historians debate its authenticity, but that's beside the point. What mattered was the instant transformation of exhausted men into zealots, their fear replaced by fanaticism. Likewise, the Spanish Reconquista saw both Christian and Muslim leaders fabricate visions or angelic voices to justify risky maneuvers. The genius lay in understanding that faith didn't need proof, it needed spectacle. A single well-timed sign from God could do what 1,000 speeches couldn't, make men charge certain death with smiles on their faces. This fusion of piety and psychology reveals a timeless truth about conflict. When people believe they're actors in a divine drama, ordinary fears fade. Medieval commanders didn't just exploit superstition, they rewired reality itself, turning battlefields into stages where the stakes weren't just life and death, but salvation and damnation. And in that cosmic calculus, even the bravest warrior might hesitate before raising a sword against heaven's chosen. Information was the invisible battlefield where medieval generals fought their most cunning duels not with steel, but with carefully crafted illusions of truth. Take Henry V at Agincourt, where his greatest weapon wasn't the longbow, but the deliberate gaps in his enemy's knowledge. By allowing French scouts to glimpse his starving, outnumbered troops while hiding his archers in the woods, he didn't just conceal his strength, he sculpted French overconfidence like a potter shaping clay. The result, a reckless cavalry charge straight into a killing zone, all because Henry understood a fundamental rule: what your opponent doesn't know can destroy them. Fake dispatches were the medieval equivalent of hacking enemy communications, except instead of code, generals used wax seals and forged handwriting. Byzantine emperors like Justinian became masters of this, planting fabricated letters on captured messengers that revealed fictitious rebel plots or imaginary troop movements. The brilliance lay in the details, a smear of mud to suggest haste, a broken seal slightly misaligned to imply tampering. These weren't just lies, they were immersive experiences designed to trigger knee-jerk reactions. Imagine being a Frankish warlord receiving intercepted orders showing your allies plotting to abandon you. Would you double down or retreat in panic? Either way, you lost. Stage deserters added another layer to this psychological hall of mirrors. The Mongols perfected this art, sending defectors with exaggerated tales of internal strife or phantom armies approaching from unexpected directions. These weren't clumsy spies, they were method actors trained to break under interrogation and spill precisely calibrated misinformation. At the Battle of Mohi in 1241, Batu Khan's fake deserters convinced Hungarian knights that the Mongols were fleeing across a vulnerable river crossing. When the Hungansers pursued, they found not retreating troops, but a deadly ambush waiting in the shallows. Perhaps the most insidious tactic was controlling the speed of information. Medieval commanders often allowed certain messengers to escape sieges carrying outdated or misleading news. By the time reinforcements arrived, the situation had radically changed, leaving allies charging into traps or relieving garrisons that had already surrendered. This temporal manipulation turned time itself into a weapon, making even accurate intelligence fatally obsolete. The true mastery of information warfare wasn't just lying, it was orchestrating a symphony of half-truths where the enemy's own assumptions became their downfall. When every scout's report, every defector's whisper, every intercepted letter might be part of an elaborate script, even reality became untrustworthy. And in that fog of manufactured doubt, the most powerful army in the world could march straight off a cliff, convinced until the last moment they were on the path to victory. The most formidable medieval armies weren't just built on strength, they were forged in the mind. While swords and shields could be handed to any recruit, true battlefield dominance required something far harder to cultivate: unshakable mental conditioning. Think of the Spartans, whose legendary composure under fire wasn't innate. It was drilled into them through relentless rituals. Boys as young as 7 endured hunger, pain, and sleep deprivation, not merely to toughen their bodies, but to rewire their very instincts. By the time they faced battle, fear had been replaced by reflex. Medieval commanders took note, adapting these principles to transform ordinary peasants into soldiers who could stand firm against charging knights or hails of arrows. Ritual played a crucial role in this psychological armor. The Templars, for instance, didn't just practice swordplay. They rehearsed every motion of battle until it became sacred routine. Their elaborate initiation ceremonies, conducted in dimly lit chapels, fused combat skills with divine purpose. A knight who believed his sword was blessed didn't just fight, he fought with the conviction of heaven's backing. Similarly, Norse berserkers used chants, animal pelts, and hallucinogenic herbs to enter trance-like states, not merely to numb pain, but to erase the very concept of retreat. These weren't just traditions, they were systematic reprogramming of human responses to danger. Superstition became another powerful tool in a commander's kit. Before major engagements, troops might be given amulets, a saint's relic, a rabbit's foot, even a scribbled prayer to foster the illusion of supernatural protection. The psychological effect was profound. A soldier clutching what he believed was Charlemagne's thumb bone didn't just feel brave, he felt chosen. Conversely, omens could be weaponized against foes. The sight of ravens circling overhead or a sudden eclipse, framed as divine displeasure, could sap an enemy's will before blades crossed. Drills served a dual purpose, honing skill and eroding fear. English longbowmen didn't just practice shooting, they trained until drawing a 6-foot bow became as natural as breathing. This relentless repetition had a hidden benefit. In the chaos of battle, muscle memory overrode panic. Swiss pikemen took this further, maneuvering in tight formations to drumbeats until their units moved like single organisms. The message to opponents was clear: these men wouldn't break because they'd forgotten how to. What made this conditioning so effective was its layered approach. Physical hardship built endurance, ritual instilled purpose, and superstition offered illusory control over fate. Together, they created soldiers who didn't just withstand terror, they weaponized it. When the Mongols faced European knights, they weren't intimidated by gleaming armor or thunderous charges. Their childhood spent hunting on the freezing steppes had already taught them to embrace discomfort as routine. Their shamans had convinced them arrows flew truer when blessed by wind spirits. Their entire culture was a masterclass in psychological resilience, and on the battlefield that proved deadlier than any sword. This wasn't just training, it was alchemy. Commanders weren't merely creating warriors, they were engineering human weapons whose greatest strength lay between their ears, because in the end, battles weren't won by the strongest army, but by the one that refused to believe it could lose. Few psychological weapons were as potent as the illusion of invincibility, a carefully cultivated myth that could bend reality before a single sword was drawn. Medieval commanders understood something profound. When an enemy believes you cannot be defeated, they've already lost half the battle. Take the legendary El Cid, the Castilian warrior whose very name struck terror into Moorish armies. His reputation was so formidable that even death couldn't diminish it. According to chroniclers, his followers strapped his lifeless body onto his horse after he fell in battle, armor polished, sword in hand, and paraded him before the enemy line. To the opposing forces, it seemed as though the man who had haunted their nightmares for decades was somehow still fighting, a grotesque masquerade that shattered their will to resist. The message was unmistakable. Not even the grave could stop him. The Teutonic Knights mastered a different kind of spectral warfare. Clad head to toe in white mantles emblazoned with black crosses, they didn't just ride into battle, they materialized like avenging angels. Their uniform wasn't just practical, it was theatrical. Against the snow-covered landscapes of the Baltic, these figures seemed to emerge from the very terrain, their sudden appearances playing on primal fears of the supernatural. To pagan tribes, these ghostly warriors weren't merely men. They were manifestations of divine wrath, an illusion the knights carefully nurtured with timed ambushes and relentless discipline. When your enemy believes you're an unstoppable force of nature, their arrows waver before they're loosed. Reputation itself became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Mongol warlord Subutai didn't just conquer cities. He orchestrated his legend with the precision of a bard crafting an epic. Stories of his campaigns crossing frozen rivers unseen, appearing hundreds of miles away in impossible time, spread faster than his cavalry. By the time his army arrived, defenders were already half convinced they faced a demigod. Likewise, Richard the Lionheart's moniker wasn't just a nickname, it was psychological artillery. The mere rumor of his approach could trigger mass desertions as enemies recalled his past mercilessness. What made these myths so devastating was their simplicity. A leader didn't need actual superhuman abilities, just the uncanny ability to make others believe he possessed them. Whether through staged miracles, calculated theatrics, or sheer consistency of victory, these commanders transformed themselves into living legends. And in an era where perception shaped reality, that was enough to turn the tide of wars without lifting a blade. Economic warfare in the Middle Ages turned markets into battlefields and harvests into weapons of mass demoralization. While sieges starved bodies, blockades starved souls, systematically dismantling not just supply lines, but the very will to resist. Consider the 100 Years' War, where English forces didn't merely surround French towns, they transformed the countryside into a psychological wasteland. Vineyards were torched, mills dismantled, and livestock slaughtered not just to deny resources, but to sever the connection between land and identity. For peasants watching generations of labor vanish in smoke, the message was visceral. Survival itself now depended on surrender, but the real genius lay in targeting commerce itself. Port cities like Calais became pressure points where economic warfare reached clinical precision. By blocking wool exports to Flanders, English strategists didn't just cripple French finances, they ignited unrest among textile workers hundreds of miles away. Suddenly, hunger in Ghent became a weapon against Paris, as starving artisans blamed their own rulers for failing to lift the blockade. This was psychological warfare at scale. making entire populations feel the weight of siege without a single wall being breached. Even water sources became tools of terror. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces catapulted plague victims over city walls, an early form of biological warfare that exploited both disease and despair. But lesser known were the subtler horrors: salting wells, dumping animal carcasses in reservoirs, or poisoning aqueducts with hellebore. These acts went beyond denying hydration, they weaponized uncertainty. Would the next sip bring relief or agony? The dread of invisible contamination often proved deadlier than thirst itself. The most devastating campaigns targeted time itself. By burning crops just before harvest, attackers didn't just destroy food, they erased futures. Imagine toiling for months only to watch your fields ignite on the eve of reaping, knowing winter would now stretch endlessly ahead. This temporal cruelty broke spirits in ways mere scarcity couldn't. Chroniclers describe villagers in Aquitaine abandoning their homes not because supplies were gone, but because the certainty of continued suffering made resistance feel pointless. What made economic warfare so insidious was its ripple effect. A single block trade route could collapse regional economies, turning merchants into refugees and artisans into beggars. As social order unraveled, so did loyalty. Peasants blamed lords for failing to protect them, lords blamed kings, and kings blamed traitors. By the time armies clashed, the real battle had already been won in the collective mind. Because when hope becomes the scarcest resource, even the strongest walls are just stone waiting to fall. Cultural differences weren't just obstacles for medieval commanders, they were blueprints for psychological destruction. The smartest generals realized that to break an enemy's spirit, you first had to understand what made their culture tick. Take the Crusaders' sack of Jerusalem in 1099. When Christian knights stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, slaughtering civilians who sought refuge there, this wasn't mere brutality. It was a calculated strike at the heart of Islamic identity. By defiling sacred spaces where generations had prayed, they weren't just killing people, they were erasing the very symbols that gave their enemies strength. The message carved in blood and broken marble was unmistakable: your gods cannot protect you. The Mongols turned cultural insight into a science. Before invading new territories, they dispatched scouts disguised as merchants to study local feuds, religious tensions, and class divisions. When they reached Khwarezm, they didn't face a unified empire. They faced a patchwork of resentful vassals and oppressed cities. By promising autonomy to Persian-speaking regions long stifled by Turkic rulers, Genghis Khan turned the empire against itself. The same pattern repeated in Russia, where Mongol commanders exploited the bitter rivalry between Novgorod and Kiev, ensuring Slavic princes were too busy betraying each other to mount a united defense. Language itself became a weapon of cultural warfare. During the Reconquista, Christian kings would issue decrees in Arabic to Muslim subjects, not for convenience but to underscore their dominance. The parchment might promise tolerance, but the medium carried its own taunt: even your words now serve our will. Similarly, when Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, he ordered church bells silenced and muezzins' calls restored. This sonic reclamation wasn't just practical, it was psychological exorcism, purging Christian echoes from Muslim ears. Even food could be cultural ammunition. During the siege of Antioch, Crusaders starved outside the walls while defenders taunted them by roasting meats where the wind would carry the scent. But the ultimate humiliation came when desperate Franks resorted to eating their own dead, a taboo that horrified both Christian and Muslim observers. The defenders knew exactly what they were doing, forcing their enemies to violate their deepest cultural norms, transforming them into monsters in their own eyes. The most devastating cultural strikes targeted identity itself. When Timur the Lame conquered Damascus in 1400, he didn't just loot its famed libraries, he forced scholars to personally burn centuries of accumulated knowledge. For a civilization that revered learning as sacred, this was spiritual murder. Likewise, Spanish conquistadors in Granada systematically renamed mosques as churches, not merely claiming spaces but rewriting history itself. These weren't acts of conquest, they were acts of uncreation, designed to make a people forget who they were. What made cultural warfare so potent was its lingering poison. A broken wall could be rebuilt, but how does a society recover when its most sacred symbols have been turned against it? That was the true victory these commanders sought, not just to defeat armies, but to dismantle the invisible structures that made resistance possible in the first place. Night was more than just the absence of light. It was a canvas for psychological terror where shadows became weapons and the unseen enemy grew monstrous in the imagination. Medieval commanders didn't just attack under cover of darkness, they weaponized the primal fear of what lurked beyond the firelight. The Welsh, masters of guerrilla warfare, turned their nocturnal raids into spectacles of dread. By striking without warning and vanishing before dawn, they didn't just inflict casualties, they fostered a chilling mythos. To English soldiers huddled in their camps, every rustle in the undergrowth might be a rebel or something far worse. Whispers spread of shapeshifters who moved like mist, of warriors who could walk through walls. The line between tactic and legend blurred until retreating to daylight felt like the only escape. But darkness wasn't just a cloak, it was a stage for elaborate deception. Some commanders ordered troops to tie lanterns to the horns of cattle, creating the illusion of a vast army marching through the hills. Others staged mock ambushes with flaming arrows shot into empty trees, convincing enemies they were surrounded by invisible archers. The psychological genius lay in the ambiguity. A real attack and a feint could feel identical when panic set in. At the Siege of Lisbon, crusaders reported seeing spectral knights riding along the moonlit beaches, visions later revealed to be local fishermen draped in stolen armor, reflecting just enough light to seem otherworldly. Sound became uncanny in the night. The sudden blast of a horn from nowhere, the distant wail of a woman, sometimes a soldier imitating one, or the deliberate clatter of pots and shields to simulate movement, all conspired to fracture an army's cohesion. Sleep deprivation amplified the effect. After nights of false alarms, even the most disciplined troops would start seeing phantoms in the fog. Chroniclers describe entire garrisons abandoning their posts at the cry of "they're in the walls," only to find the fortress empty at sunrise. The most devastating night strikes exploited cultural fears. In Scandinavia, raiders might leave behind carved figures resembling the Norse Draugr, undead warriors to unsettle Christian defenders. Muslim armies in Iberia timed attacks to coincide with the Hour of the Jinn, when supernatural beings were believed to roam. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were tailored psychological operations. When your enemy already fears the dark, you don't need to conquer them. You just need to help them surrender to their own nightmares. What made night warfare so effective was its lingering damage. Daylight might reveal the tricks, the smeared paint mistaken for blood, the ropes rigged to mimic footsteps, but the trauma remained. Soldiers who'd survived a night of unseen terrors didn't just fear the next attack, they feared their own minds. And that was the ultimate victory. When an army stopped trusting its senses, it had already lost the will to fight. Words could cut deeper than any blade in medieval warfare, especially when crafted into psychological weapons. The Hussites, a rebellious faction in 15th century Bohemia, turned their religious hymns into battle anthem songs so potent they became synonymous with resistance. Imagine the scene, columns of peasant soldiers advancing not with battle cries, but with haunting harmonies, their voices weaving through the smoke of burning villages. To their followers, these hymns were divine inspiration, proof that God marched with them. But to their enemies, the heavily armored knights of the Holy Roman Empire, the same melodies carried an eerie, unsettling power. Here were untrained farmers and craftsmen, outnumbered and outgunned, yet singing as if victory were already assured. That dissonance between expectation and reality sowed doubt in even the most seasoned warriors. Slogans and chants served a similar purpose, compressing complex ideologies into razor-sharp phrases. During the Peasants' Revolt in England, the rallying cry, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" wasn't just poetry, it was propaganda weaponized to undermine the feudal hierarchy. A single rhyme repeated across villages could unravel centuries of ingrained obedience by exposing the artificiality of noble privilege. Likewise, Norse berserkers roared, "Odin owns you all," before charging, a psychological one-two punch. It steeled their own ranks while framing opposition as sacrilege. But perhaps the most insidious linguistic warfare happened in the shadows. Graffiti scrawled on city gates or defamatory pamphlets slipped into marketplaces could turn allies into enemies overnight. In the run-up to the siege of Constantinople, Ottoman agents spread verses accusing Emperor Constantine of abandoning Christian virtues, a smear campaign designed to fracture loyalty among his subjects. Meanwhile, the Byzantines retaliated with rumors that maimed the Second's armies desecrated churches, turning neutral observers into fervent resistors. These weren't just lies, they were narrative landmines detonating trust where it mattered most. The true mastery lay in timing. A well-placed ballad mocking a king's cowardice, sung in taverns along trade routes, could erode morale faster than a lost battle. When the Hussites wanted to unnerve besieging forces, they'd blast their hymns from city walls at dawn, ensuring the enemy's first waking moments were steeped in dread. Language in these hands wasn't just communication. It was a siege engine for the mind, capable of breaching defenses no stone wall could withstand. Because once words made doubt take root, even the strongest fortress became vulnerable from within. Horses weren't just mounts in medieval warfare, they were extensions of a warrior's identity, their thunderous hooves drumming terror into enemies long before the first arrow flew. The Mongols took this to its zenith, breeding small, hardy steppe ponies that could cover staggering distances without tiring. To opposing armies, these riders seemed almost supernatural, appearing out of nowhere like a storm from the open plains. Their unique tactic of shooting arrows at full gallop, twisting in their saddles with impossible precision, fueled rumors they weren't men at all but mythical centaurs. Imagine facing a force that blurred the line between human and beast, where every rider and horse moved as a single, unstoppable organism. That psychological edge was no accident. It was cultivated through generations of selective breeding and relentless training, turning the bond between warrior and animal into something far deadlier than the sum of its parts. But horses were just the beginning. War elephants, massive, armored, and often draped in vividly dyed cloth, were the tanks of the ancient world, their mere presence enough to shatter untrained formations. When Alexander the Great first encountered them in India, his men recoiled in horror at these living fortresses. By the medieval era, their use had become psychological theater. Some commanders strapped blades to their tusks or soaked their trunks in flammable oils, creating fire-breathing spectacles. Others painted them in garish patterns or hung bells from their harnesses, turning each lumbering step into a cacophony of dread. For European armies unfamiliar with elephants, the effect was paralyzing. Chroniclers describe horses bolting in panic, their riders helpless against an enemy that seemed to defy nature itself. Dogs played a darker role in this bestiary of war. Mastiffs and wolfhounds weren't just sentries, they were instruments of calculated terror. The Spanish conquistadors unleashed armored war dogs upon Native American warriors, animals trained to cripple rather than kill, their snapping jaws deliberately aimed at tendons and faces. The screams of the first victims often triggered mass retreats, as the psychological toll of fighting beasts that mauled without mercy overwhelmed even seasoned fighters. Some armies went further, coating dogs in pitch and setting them alight before driving them into enemy lines, a grotesque fusion of animal and weapon that haunted survivors for decades. Then there were the bees, yes, bees. At the Siege of Belgrade in 1456, Hungarian defenders catapulted hive after hive into Ottoman ranks. The enraged swarms didn't just sting, they created chaos so absolute that entire battalions broke formation, clawing at their armor in mindless panic. Other commanders hung hives along castle walls like living mines, ensuring attackers would trigger a buzzing nightmare with every scaling attempt. This wasn't just clever tactics, it was psychological alchemy, transforming nature's most mundane creatures into weapons of mass disorientation. What made animal warfare so devastating wasn't just the physical damage, it was the way it exploited deep-seated instincts. A horse's scream, an elephant's trumpet, the guttural growl of a war dog. These sounds bypassed rational thought, triggering primal fear responses no amount of training could fully erase. And the generals who wielded these creatures understood something profound. Sometimes, the most effective weapon isn't a blade or a bow, but the uncontrollable pulse of terror that flares in the human heart when faced with the unnatural. Whether through myth, spectacle, or sheer biological shock, animals turned battlefields into hunting grounds where the prey was always the mind first, the body second. Nothing shaped the fate of armies quite like the illusion of destiny, and medieval generals became virtuosos at staging omens to bend morale to their will. Consider the Norman invasion of England in 1066, where Duke William faced a problem: how to convince his troops that crossing the Channel to attack a fortified kingdom wasn't suicide. Then Halley's comet streaked across the sky. Most saw a celestial curiosity. William saw a script. His propagandist swiftly reframed the comet's appearance as God's own seal of approval, a blazing arrow pointing toward England. Overnight, what might have been viewed as a bad luck sign transformed into divine mandate, turning reluctant soldiers into fervent holy warriors. But comets were just the beginning. Commanders orchestrated entire theatrical productions to manipulate superstition. Before the Battle of Agincourt, Henry V's scouts reportedly discovered a prophecy carved into an ancient oak, conveniently foretelling French defeat. Similarly, Byzantine emperors employed court astrologers to predict victories, ensuring these carefully crafted forecasts spread through the ranks. The brilliance lay in the details, using obscure astrological alignments or rediscovered scriptures that sounded just plausible enough to feel fated. Some omens were brutally tactile. The night before the siege of Antioch, Crusader priests buried a rusty spearhead in the cathedral floor, then miraculously unearthed it as the holy lance that pierced Christ's side. The effect was electric. Starving, demoralized soldiers suddenly fought like men possessed, their desperation reframed as sacred purpose. Conversely, the Mongols staged omens of doom for their enemies. Scouts would leave bizarre tokens: a wolf's skull facing backward, arrows arranged in cursed patterns, letting defenders' imaginations magnify the threat. The most chilling omens exploited natural phenomena. A sudden eclipse could be framed as heaven's disapproval, while a downpour might be spun as divine tears for the enemy's sins. At the Battle of Toten during the Wars of the Roses, Lancastrian commanders pointed to the wind blowing snow in Yorkist faces as proof of God's wrath. Yet when the wind shifted, Yorkist leaders simply reversed the narrative, claiming it now signaled divine favor for their cause. What made these staged prophecies so potent was their ambiguity. A falling meteor, a flock of birds in unnatural formation, even the birth of a two-headed calf in a nearby village any could be weaponized. The key was timing and presentation. A prophet shrieking doom outside city gates at midnight carried far more weight than the same words in broad daylight. By hijacking the human instinct to seek patterns in chaos, generals didn't just predict the future, they authored it. And in that gap between superstition and certainty, battles were won before a single sword was drawn. Warfare wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was staged in the public square, where every parade, every execution, every carefully choreographed display was a performance designed to rewrite reality in the minds of both victors and vanquished. Take Vlad the Impaler's infamous forest of stakes outside the gates of Targov East. 20,000 Turkish prisoners lined the road, impaled in grotesque rows. A spectacle so horrifying that Ottoman chroniclers wrote of Sultan maimed the Second's army retreating not from defeat, but from sheer psychological revulsion. This wasn't just brutality, it was theater. The stakes were angled deliberately, some victims placed higher so their agonized silhouettes would catch the setting sun, casting elongated shadows across the approaching army's path. The message wasn't just, "We can kill you," it was, "We can make death itself a work of art." But spectacle wasn't always about terror. The grand entries of kings into conquered cities were masterclasses in psychological transformation. When Richard the Lionheart reclaimed Acre, he didn't just march through the gates, he staged a procession so lavish it overwrote the trauma of siege. Trumpeters heralded his arrival, priests swung censers of incense to purify the air, and banners depicting his victories unfurled along the streets like a living tapestry. To the defeated citizens, this wasn't just a change of ruler. It was the erasure of their old world, replaced by a new order dripping with divine symbolism. Even the horses were part of the act, caparisoned in cloth of gold, their hooves polished to mirror brightness, so every step seemed to scatter light like celestial approval. Mock battles took this illusion further. Before major campaigns, some commanders would stage full-scale reenactments outside city walls, complete with fireworks and painted backdrops. The citizens of Constantinople once watched in awe as Byzantine troops fought an invisible enemy, their choreographed maneuvers so precise they seemed to battle ghosts. The lesson was clear: our army doesn't just defeat flesh and blood foes, we conquer the impossible. And then there were the subtler performances. A captured nobleman paraded in chains one day might appear the next as a guest at the victor's table, clad in fine silks. This abrupt shift wasn't caprice, it was psychological whiplash, keeping former elites perpetually off balance. Were they prisoners or pawns? The uncertainty made them pliable. Even the architecture of victory played a role. Triumphal arches weren't just monuments, they were psychological thresholds. To pass under one meant accepting, on some primal level, that the old order was gone. The true genius of these theatrical displays lay in their duality. To the victors, they were affirmations of power rituals that transformed bloodshed into something grander, almost sacred. But to the conquered, they were meticulously crafted nightmares, designed to replace resistance with resignation. Because when the line between reality and performance blurs, surrender stops feeling like defeat and starts feeling like the only possible ending to the story. Few tactics in medieval warfare were as dangerous or as devastatingly effective as the art of pretending to flee. What looked like panic to an enemy was often a carefully choreographed trap, turning their moment of triumph into the prelude to catastrophe. The Mongols elevated this ruse to near perfection. Their cavalry would launch furious attacks, then suddenly scatter as if overwhelmed, luring opponents into reckless pursuit. But these weren't disorganized retreats. Every rider knew exactly where to regroup, often funneling enemies into hidden kill zones where fresh troops waited. At the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, this tactic annihilated a Rus army twice their size. The pursuing knights, convinced they were routing a broken foe, galloped straight into a canyon where Mongol archers rained death from the cliffs above. By the time they realized their mistake, escape was impossible. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings hinged on a similar deception. When Norman knights feigned retreat after an initial assault, the English shield wall, disciplined until that moment, shattered as warriors broke ranks to chase what seemed like easy prey. But William's forces hadn't lost heart. They'd rehearsed this exact scenario. As the English surged forward, Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut them down from the flanks. The genius lay in understanding human nature. Nothing provokes reckless abandon like the illusion of a crumbling enemy. Feigned weakness could be even subtler. During the siege of Antioch, Crusader leaders intentionally let their desperation show, staging public arguments, letting hunger-weakened soldiers be seen by enemy scouts. To the Muslim garrison, this signaled an army on the verge of collapse. What they couldn't see were the secret foraging parties gathering supplies or the hidden tunnels being dug beneath their walls. When the final assault came, it wasn't from a starving rabble but a force that had weaponized its own apparent frailty. The risk, of course, was losing control of the narrative. A pretend retreat could spiral into real panic if troops misunderstood the plan or if the enemy pressed too hard. That's why the best commanders paired these gambits with unshakable discipline. Mongol units used flag signals and drumbeats to coordinate their chaos, while Byzantine generals drilled their men to retreat in precise formations, maintaining order even in apparent disarray. The lesson was clear: to deceive an enemy convincingly, you first had to master yourself, because in the end, the most lethal weapon wasn't the ambush, it was the certainty you planted in your foe's mind that victory was already theirs. The true power of siege weapons wasn't just measured in shattered stone, it was counted in the screams that echoed long before the first projectile flew. Take the Warwolf, the colossal trebuchet built for Edward I's assault on Stirling Castle. Towering over the landscape, its very construction was a psychological masterstroke. For months, defenders watched as this monstrous engine took shape, a slow, deliberate spectacle designed to make walls feel flimsy before a single rock was loaded. By the time it launched its first shot, the castle's fate was already sealed in the minds of those trapped inside. The Warwolf didn't just break fortifications, it broke the illusion of safety, turning sturdy stone into a cage of creeping dread. Then there was Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's most guarded secret. This viscous, flammable liquid didn't just burn, it defied all logic. Water only spread its flames, sand seemed to fuel it, and the eerie blue-green hue made it look like dragon's breath made manifest. Sailors told stories of ships engulfed in seconds, men leaping into the sea only to find the fire clinging to them even underwater. The terror didn't come from the deaths it caused, but from the way it shattered understanding. When fire behaves like a living thing, when it laughs at every attempt to quench it, even the bravest warrior starts questioning the laws of nature and his own survival. But perhaps the most insidious siege weapons were the ones that never touched a wall. The Mongols would catapult diseased corpses over fortifications, turning biology into a weapon. The stench alone could trigger panic, but the real horror came days later when fever began spreading through the ranks. Defenders didn't just fight invaders, they fought their own bodies betraying them. Other commanders launched barrels of quicklime into besieged cities, where the powder mixed with moisture in the air to create choking, caustic fog. Imagine gasping for breath while your eyes burn and your skin blisters, all because the wind carried an invisible killer over your walls. The brilliance of these weapons lay in their dual nature. Every hiss of Greek fire, every groan of the Warwolf's arm, every cough from a plague-ridden comrade whispered the same question: how do you fight what you don't understand? That was the ultimate goal, not just to break bodies, but to fracture the mind's ability to resist. Because once defenders stopped believing in victory, even the thickest walls became as fragile as the morale behind them. Elite units in medieval warfare weren't just skilled fighters. They were walking legends, their reputations carefully cultivated to strike fear into enemies before a single blow was landed. Take the Varangian Guard, the towering Norse and Anglo-Saxon warriors who served as the Byzantine emperor's personal protectors. Clad in gleaming armor and wielding massive two-handed axes, they weren't merely bodyguards, they were living myths. Byzantine chroniclers spun tales of their unbreakable oaths, claiming they'd fight to the death even if their emperor fell. To opposing armies, these stories transformed the Guard into something more than human. Imagine facing a wall of these giants, their axes glinting in the sun, knowing they wouldn't retreat, wouldn't surrender, wouldn't even flinch. That wasn't just a military unit, it was a psychological avalanche. The Templars mastered a different kind of myth-making. Their iconic white mantles, emblazoned with red crosses, weren't just uniforms, they were symbols of divine favor. Rumors swirled that these warrior monks possessed sacred relics, even fragments of the true cross that made them invincible in battle. Some enemies whispered they couldn't be killed, that arrows miraculously veered away from their chests. The truth was far simpler. The Templars were exceptionally disciplined, their ranks filled with knights who trained relentlessly. But by letting the legends flourish, they turned themselves into boogeymen. When their charge broke enemy lines at Montjesard, outnumbered 12-1, it wasn't just skill that won the day. It was the paralyzing certainty among their foes that they were battling something supernatural. Then there were the Hashashin, the shadowy sect whose very name became synonymous with terror. Unlike other elite units, they rarely fought in open battle. Instead, their power came from the stories whispered about them, tales of assassins slipping past dozens of guards to leave a dagger on a sultan's pillow as he slept. The message wasn't just, "We can kill you." It was, "We can reach you anywhere, anytime, and your armies can't stop us." Their leader, the Old Man of the Mountain, allegedly demonstrated this by ordering two men to leap to their deaths from a tower just to prove his followers' absolute loyalty. Whether true or not, the story spread like wildfire, making rulers think twice before crossing him. What made these units so effective wasn't just their combat prowess. It was the aura of inevitability they cultivated. The Teutonic Knights didn't just wear white cloaks, they staged their arrivals like divine interventions, appearing suddenly on snow-covered battlefields where their uniforms made them seem to materialize from the landscape itself. The Swiss pikemen's reputation for never breaking formation turned their advance into a psychological sledgehammer opponents knew trying to flank them was futile, so they often didn't even try. These weren't just soldiers, they were psychological force multipliers, bending enemies' wills before the fighting even began. The brilliance of these elite units lay in their duality. They were both real and unreal flesh and blood warriors whose legends outpaced their actual abilities. A Varangian guard might be mortal, but when dozens of chronicles claim he can cleave a horse in half with one swing, does it matter? By the time an enemy faced them on the battlefield, the fight was already half lost, not to steel but to stories, and in the end that was their deadliest weapon, not the blades in their hands but the myths in their enemies' minds. Before the clash of steel came the ritual ceremonies so potent they could transform trembling recruits into unbreakable warriors. Across medieval Europe, battle preparations weren't just about sharpening blades, they were about forging minds. The Norse berserkers didn't simply charge into combat, they entered states of ritualized frenzy, chewing on shields, howling like wolves, and working themselves into trances through chants and hallucinogenic brews. This wasn't mere savagery, it was psychological alchemy. By shedding their humanity in sacred ceremony, they became something beyond fear, vessels of Odin's fury, incapable of retreat. Christian knights underwent their own metamorphosis through vigil and vow. On the eve of battle, they'd spend hours in prayer, touching relics of saints or dipping their swords in holy water. These rites did more than bless weapons, they rewired instincts. A soldier who believed his blade had been kissed by the Virgin Mary's tears didn't just fight, he fought with the conviction of divine purpose. The Templars took this further, embedding rituals into their very identity. New members endured elaborate initiation rites, nights spent in darkened chapels, oaths whispered over gravestones, creating bonds so deep that desertion became unthinkable. To break rank wasn't just cowardice, it was sacrilege. Even seemingly mundane acts carried psychological weight. The shared drinking of pre-battle mead, the synchronized strapping of armor, the communal sharpening of swords, all were rituals of unity, turning individuals into a single organism. The Mongols understood this intimately. Before campaigns, Genghis Khan would gather his generals for a ceremonial hunt, not just for food, but to rehearse coordination and trust. The chase mirrored battle tactics, the kill symbolized inevitable victory, and the feast afterward wove camaraderie into their bones. By the time they faced enemies, they moved as one mind in many bodies. Some rituals weaponized terror itself. Celtic warriors painted their bodies blue with woad before combat, their swirling patterns mimicking spirits in the half-light. The effect was visceral. Opponents didn't see men, but nightmares given flesh. Aztec armies staged mock sacrifices before marches, letting captives blood-soak temple steps while drums pulsed like a heartbeat. These spectacles weren't just for the gods, they were psychological primers, convincing warriors that death in battle was a sacred transition rather than an end. The brilliance of these rituals lay in their duality. To outsiders, they might seem like superstition or spectacle, but to those who partook, they were psychological armor, spells cast not with magic, but with symbolism so potent it could override the most basic human instinct, self-preservation. When a berserker truly believed he was already dead, when a knight felt heaven's hand guiding his sword, when a Mongol horseman saw his Khan's will as destiny itself, that's when rituals stopped being ceremony and became the invisible force that won wars. Joan of Arc wasn't just a warrior, she was a living lightning rod for divine fervor, proof that psychological warfare wasn't confined to battle-hardened generals. When this teenage peasant girl in rusted armor rallied broken French troops, she didn't just carry a banner, she weaponized faith itself. To her followers, her visions of saints were celestial endorsements, transforming desperation into holy certainty. But her enemies didn't attack her with swords, they targeted her credibility, branding her a witch. This was psychological combat at its most raw, not just fighting a girl, but erasing the myth that empowered her. Because once Joan was captured, the English didn't execute her quietly. They staged her trial as a spectacle, aiming to shatter the legend by reducing her to a frightened heretic. Yet even in defeat, her legacy became a double-edged sword. The French spun her death into martyrdom, while the English found their victory hollow, having killed the girl, but not the idea she represented. Women's roles in siege warfare reveal even darker layers of psychological manipulation. Countess Jean de Penthièvre didn't just defend Hennebont Castle during the Breton War of Succession, she turned her very presence into a tactical advantage. When enemy forces assumed a woman's leadership signaled weakness, she orchestrated a midnight raid in person, riding through the camp with her hair unbound and armor gleaming, a spectral figure meant to disorient and terrify. The message was clear: the norms of warfare didn't apply here. Similarly, during the siege of Montségur, Cathar women stood on the ramparts singing hymns as flames consumed them, their defiance echoing louder than any battle cry. Witnesses described the scene as both horrifying and hypnotic, a psychological blow that lingered long after the fortress fell. But for every Joan or Jean, countless unnamed women were exploited as psychological pawns. Defenders might parade noble women on the walls in fine silks to signal abundance during a siege, while attackers catapulted the bodies of raped villagers over ramparts to spread despair. The Mongols perfected a grisly calculus. By sparing some women and children after massacres, they ensured survivors carried tales of selective mercy, making the next town more likely to surrender. These weren't random acts, they were calibrated strikes at the human instinct to protect, to hope, or to fear. The most insidious manipulations targeted cultural perceptions of femininity itself. Muslim chroniclers wrote of Crusader women fighting in armor, their gender revealed only when their corpses were looted, a detail meant to unsettle readers with the unnaturalness of female warriors. Conversely, Christian accounts depicted Saracen women as sorceresses, their veils hiding not faces but dark magic. These narratives did more than demonize, they stripped women of humanity, turning them into symbols to be either venerated or violated for psychological effect. What made women so potent in medieval psychological warfare wasn't their swords or strategies, but their symbolic weight. A noblewoman's ransom could fracture alliances, a peasant girl's vision could birth an army, and a mother's wail from a burning village could unravel the resolve of hardened soldiers. Because in a world where women were idealized as saints, mothers, or temptresses, their presence or absence could rewrite the emotional calculus of war itself. And the generals who understood this didn't just fight with steel, they fought with the power of stories, knowing that sometimes the most devastating siege engine was the human heart. Some battles weren't fought in months or seasons, they were waged across lifetimes, where the real weapons were ink, parchment, and the slow poison of collective memory. Take the systematic vilification of Saladin in medieval Europe. After his stunning recapture of Jerusalem in 1187, Christian chroniclers faced a dilemma: how to reconcile their reverence for chivalry with the fact that their ideal knight, courteous, honorable, devout, was a Muslim sultan. The solution: a propaganda campaign so relentless it reshaped Western perceptions for centuries. Saladin's mercy toward surrendered Christians became twisted into cunning, his battlefield brilliance recast as sorcery. By the time Dante wrote the Divine Comedy over 100 years later, Saladin languished in limbo, not for his sins, but because Europe's imagination could no longer separate the man from the monster it had invented. This long-game warfare didn't just target individuals, it rewrote entire cultures. The Teutonic Knights, while crusading in Prussia, commissioned woodcuts depicting pagan rituals as grotesque parodies, babies sacrificed in cauldrons, priests communing with horned demons. Never mind that these scenes were fabrications, they served their purpose. Generations of European children grew up shuddering at the savagery of the Baltic tribes, making future conquests feel less like invasions and more like holy rescues. The same tactic fueled the Reconquista, where Spanish artists painted Moorish rule as a blight on Christendom, their elegant libraries and hospitals erased from tapestries, replaced with scenes of desecrated churches. History became a mirror held up to justify tomorrow's wars. Relics played a chilling role in these generational campaigns. When the Burgundians displayed the skeletal remains of Saint Sebastian during the 100 Years' War, they weren't just invoking divine favor, they were weaponizing collective trauma. Each rib, each yellowed bone was a visceral reminder of martyrdom, a physical tether to past atrocities that could be dusted off to stoke fresh hatred. The message was clear: our wounds never heal, and neither should yours. Even architectural destruction served this purpose. The deliberate defacing of Islamic geometric patterns in conquered Spanish mosques replaced with Christian iconography wasn't mere renovation. It was a slow, stone-carved sermon. Your past is rubble, your future belongs to us. The most insidious campaigns targeted language itself. After the Albigensian Crusade, Occitan poetry, once the pride of southern France, was systematically suppressed, its troubadours silenced or co-opted. Without songs to carry their stories, the Cathars didn't just lose a war, they lost their place in history. Similarly, Norse skaldic verses praising Viking raids were transcribed by Christian monks but with key edits. Odin's wisdom became devilry, Valhalla's glory turned to folly. Over generations, these subtle revisions altered cultural DNA, making ancestral heroes seem like brutes and invaders feel like liberators. What made these long-term strategies so devastating was their invisibility. A soldier might resist a sword strike, but how do you parry an idea woven into your childhood lullabies? When every stained glass window in your cathedral shows your ancestors as demons, when every chronicle reduces your gods to superstition, the war isn't just around you, it's inside you. And that's the cruelest truth of psychological warfare. The battles fought with pens often outlast those fought with swords, because the wounds they leave aren't on skin, but in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Legacy isn't just about remembering the past, it's about recognizing the same shadows lurking in today's wars, where algorithms replace trebuchets and viral rumors do the work of flaming arrows. The psychological playbook medieval generals perfected hasn't faded, it's evolved. Modern propaganda doesn't catapult plague-ridden corpses over walls, but it does weaponize disinformation, seeding chaos with fabricated videos or doctored audio clips that spread faster than any medieval herald could dream. Fear still paralyzes, deception still disorients, only now the battlefield is digital and the siege engines are social media algorithms. Take the concept of staged retreats, a Mongol specialty. Today, it mirrors the way hostile actors flood online spaces with fake retreats, manufacturing the illusion of victory to lure opponents into complacency. A coordinated bot army might suddenly withdraw from a hashtag debate, only to resurge hours later when their targets drop their guard. The tactics are identical: feign weakness, exploit overconfidence, then strike when resistance crumbles. Even the Mongols' use of selective brutality finds its parallel in modern cyber warfare. Ransomware attacks don't target everyone. They demonstrate ruthless efficiency on a few high-profile victims, leaving others to wonder, will I be next? The psychological toll of anticipation often proves more damaging than the attack itself. Symbols, too, have migrated from banners to pixels. Medieval armies flew sacred relics to claim divine favor. Today, state-sponsored troll farms appropriate cultural icons, religious imagery, patriotic slogans to cloak manipulation in legitimacy. A viral video splicing a politician's speech with ominous music isn't just misinformation. It's the digital equivalent of staging an eclipse to signal heavenly displeasure. And just as medieval commanders exploited linguistic divides, modern operatives stoke ethnic or political tensions by flooding minority communities with polarizing content in their native languages. The tools change, but the goal remains: fracture unity, then conquer. Perhaps the most haunting parallel lies in the weaponization of faith. Joan of Arc's visions find their echo in deepfake videos of leaders appearing to endorse extremist causes, or AI-generated audio of clerics issuing fatwas that never existed. The terror isn't in the technology, it's in the erosion of reality itself, mirroring how medieval defenders questioned their senses when faced with staged miracles or fabricated omens. When truth becomes negotiable, morale collapses long before the servers do. Understanding these echoes isn't just academic, it's survival. The generals of old didn't win because they had better swords. They won because they understood the human mind's vulnerabilities. Today, as bots whisper tailored fears into our pockets and algorithms amplify our deepest biases, that same understanding is the only shield we have. Because the oldest rule of warfare still holds, the battle isn't fought with weapons but with the minds that wield them, or in this age, the minds that scroll, share, and believe. From fear to folklore, medieval generals waged wars not just on land but in the mind. Their tactics remind us that victory often belongs to those who control perception. As you reflect on these strategies, consider how much of modern conflict is still psychological. If you found this dive into the mind games of history fascinating, don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories of the past. The battlefield is everywhere, especially in the mind. Think about the last time a rumor swayed your opinion or a headline made your pulse race. That's the echo of medieval psychological warfare, only now. The trebuchets are Twitter bots, and the siege towers are viral misinformation campaigns. The Mongols didn't need algorithms to spread terror. They had refugees carrying tales of carnage. Today, a single doctored video can achieve the same effect, proving that while the tools have evolved, human psychology remains startlingly unchanged. The real lesson here isn't just about history, it's about awareness. Medieval peasants didn't realize their fear of omens was being manipulated until it was too late. In our hyper-connected world, we have the chance to spot these patterns before they paralyze us. When a post triggers outrage, ask yourself, is this a genuine crisis or a modern-day version of torches planted on a hillside to simulate an army? These ancient tactics also reveal a paradox. The more advanced our technology, the more vulnerable we become to primal fears. A deepfake taps into the same instinct that made medieval soldiers flee at the sight of a staged eclipse, the terror of a reality that can't be trusted. The difference is we now have the tools to fight back. Critical thinking is our shield, skepticism our sword. So the next time you feel a surge of emotion, whether fear, anger, or unshakable conviction, pause. Ask who benefits from that reaction, because the greatest generals of history didn't win by brute force alone. They won by understanding that the most decisive battles are fought not with steel, but with stories. And in an age where stories spread at the speed of light, that truth has never been more vital. If this exploration of psychological warfare resonated with you, let us know in the comments what modern tactics remind you of these medieval strategies. And for more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping history and today's world, hit that subscribe button. The past isn't just a collection of dates and battles, it's a mirror reflecting the timeless playbook of human conflict. And in that reflection, we might just find the wisdom to navigate the wars